discussion. Maybe we could highlight some of the most profound ideas from both of the presentations and the works by our guests. So, Rahul, I noted down a few of the points you're bringing up here. So, I'm sort of quoting you here. Urbanism is not about grand visions, but rather about grand adjustments. I know this is one of your key theses in your research. And then today in your presentation, you brought up a lot of examples where actually you bring up the point of designing for transitions versus absolutes. And also you speak about transitions that are not so linear. They're much more complex, and we cannot have a one-way approach to them. And of course, the big argument that urbanism should be seen as an elastic condition. We need to have more soft and malleable systems.
And I just want to summarize a few of the more provocative points that Filiep, you made during your presentation. I think the whole concept of open systems thinking and reflecting on some of the writings of Richard Sennett and Saskia Sassen are really interesting. But I was also...
Can you please speak louder?
Sure. Okay, so I was saying that some of the most interesting points that Filiep made was this notion of open systems thinking, and how we can, similar to Rahul, how we can create, design and create spaces with the potential and possibility for action. But there are also some other points that I think are latent in the work that you've been doing and in the New Urban Agenda, which is really about the people, fundamentally, and how to sort of manage urban displacement as an inherent part of urban growth. And so that the New Urban Agenda really takes into consideration indeterminacy, flux, as Rahul had mentioned, and new kinds of urban systems that are sort of where the physical city is informing the policy and the politics are in dialogue with the physical city. And of course, all of this is, must happen under the condition of climate change and the kinds of migrations that we're going to be witnessing in this century. So with that, shall we start with a first question?
Questions, yeah, and then Filiep, you can just jump in with different questions and engage with Rahul as well. So starting with the big question of governance, both Rahul, you brought up the example of Kummela, and you brought this kind of like very interesting idea of shifting governance structures and looking into governance as more time-based. And then in your case, Filiep, you brought up the example of the Fuhar camp in Palestine, where it was this kind of like more bottom-up thinking and process. So, I mean, there is a collective failure of imagination at the level of governance, and there is a tendency to perceive refugees and migrants as a burden on infrastructure. Many times, even far more insidious, we've seen instances that they're seen as a threat to traditions and customs. So I guess a big question is, how could we possibly leverage the existing bottom-up initiatives? All of these networks of activism that definitely exist, there's all of this energy that starts from the bottom more efficiently, rather than only relying on this kind of like top-down and unite direction, one direction, sort of like governance that comes from our governments or even from relief response initiatives, possibly.
I think there's something interesting happening even today. All the big cities are meeting in Copenhagen. The C40 organization. They're meeting in Copenhagen today and tomorrow. And their main message is, which is very echoes what's happening in the US, if national governments are not delivering on the change, we will. And they have similar messages when it comes to dealing with refugees and migration. So there, I just wanted to, I agree, I'll come to the bottom-up point, but there is this very strong message coming from cities that the world's problems are huge, we are in the front line, we are willing and committed to deal with it. And for me, it goes a little bit to the essence of cities, exactly that cities has always been the places for this, for change. Of course, like I said, the timelines are accelerating, and there is a problem which is being dealt with in the book, which I didn't talk about, is that the way we look at democracy and urban democracy is shifting, because what you do in your city, especially when we talk about climate change, the impact is somewhere else. And the causality between your actions and what is happening is no longer local. And that creates a big problem for dealing with populism and dealing with these kind of bottom-up negative forces, which of course then translate easily at the national level in a political agenda which is taking us away from multilateralism, taking us away from this global agenda which we just all agreed on a couple of years ago, not just on climate but also on migration and on refugees. And of course, if you listen to the mayors, they are very much building on those bottom-up forces in their cities and mobilizing. They can only do that if they're able to mobilize their communities and make them part. I'll add one thing to that, which is one experience that we've highlighted in our work on migration, is that there is, because it always will be a shock, and we work in cities in Lebanon and Iraq where populations have doubled. And where the mayor is telling us, my first worry is that our 18-year-olds are not going to attack the refugees. Social cohesion and social peace is the first and so managing that when it is a shock, managing that kind of shock is extremely difficult and important, but it is about the basics then. Access to services, making sure that the needs of both are somehow addressed and not just the need of the new arrivals. And I'll end by saying that exactly. We had a mayor in a town in Belgium that has, and he just became a minister for integration. He has driven forward this whole notion of the changing narrative. If we have new arrivals, the identity of what it means to be a citizen in that city is changing. The city is changing. And really focusing also on the bottom-up narrative, the constant dialogue, what it means to be part of this city. And of course, we're in New York, where this is almost part of the DNA of people. But in a lot of these medium-sized cities, all of this is exactly, it's confronted with an identity that had somehow been shaped and formed, and people thought that they were not going to change. And we need leaders that are able to have that dialogue and narrative. And for me, it's the essence of governance is also part of that leadership and driving that new narrative.
I was mentioning positive bottom-up initiatives because we have witnessed those, and the media don't necessarily make us aware of those. Just kind of like a small clarification. Yeah.
Rahul, would you like to contribute to the conversation?
Yes, thank you very much. I caught most of it. Part of the voice was garbled, but I think you flagged out, Loukia, you flagged out the question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. You flagged out the question of transitions versus absolute. So I just want to kind of dwell on that for a second. But I think I want to pick up on some of the last point that was made about governance and about how what the mayor has to deal with to start with is just peace before one can actually even begin to deal with other questions. And I think these might be useful questions for us to think about a governance structure. So first, I think between the transitionary and the absolute, and I talked about transitioning settlements, I think that's kind of an endemic, that's a problem within the profession, within governance structures, where we tend to naturally, that's been the culture of dealing with cities, is to look at absolute solutions. And the designing of transitionary solutions or solutions in transitions or dealing with conditions in transition is a whole different game. and it means different kinds of partnerships. And I think the example of the question of governance and how a mayor deals with an influx of refugees or migrants exactly points to that. And so I think one of the questions this also throws up is, and I've often raised this, is that we tend to organize our conversations about urbanism in these very neat binaries. And so for governance too, it becomes the state versus the private, but the private then expanded into civil society, the NGO sector, whether it's the Red Cross or whether it's many, many international agencies that come in. And I think the new normal will really be mayors and the state finding ways for productive partnerships in a formalized way. Right now, these partnerships happen in informal ways sometimes, where aid agencies or NGOs step in to respond to a crisis. But I think in an anticipatory way, the state will have to begin to preempt and to anticipate and set into place possibilities of these partnerships which can be activated at very short notice. And these are, and going back to the Kumbh Mela, the transitionary governance structure, I think one can learn from events like that to see how we can similarly simulate something like that, but not on a permanent basis, but which can be called into action, but with anticipated formal structures. And I think that really is a very important area which we need to pay attention to, because it'll have implications on the way then we design our physical responses to these conditions.
Thank you very much. There's a question that we sort of anticipated, and I think you both touched on it in your last response, and you in particular, Filiep, which has to do with the right to citizenship, which varies obviously depending upon one's status, whether they're considered a refugee, an asylum seeker, an undocumented immigrant, or an economic migrant. Their status on paper has a huge implication for their access to property, employment, education, healthcare, mobility, and of course, most importantly for us architects, space. So the question is, how can we provide overlapping benefits to people regardless of their legal status? Are there ways in which we can leverage different resources, benefits that might have been segregated and allocated for one thing or one community, and use them to proactively and effectively, help the host community? Something that was designated for refugees, let's say, might help to improve infrastructure for the host community as well. Rahul.
I could go in different directions with this one. But for us, when we deal with influx of refugees or migrants, we've been making the arguments to UNHCR, the refugee agency, and IOM, the migration agency, that very often this is an influx of people irrespective of their status. And the solution is largely looking at it from an urban perspective. This is a growth in population, pressure on housing, pressure on infrastructure. So start with looking at this from an urban perspective, urban planning, urban management, and then be aware of the specific vulnerabilities that these people have because of their status, in terms of access to specific goods, specific services. So that's one side of the equation. On the other side, if you look at the reality, and again, of course, I'm not talking about Madrid or Barcelona or Brussels, but the biggest presence of refugee migrants is not in Europe, is elsewhere, is in the Middle East to begin with. And there are a lot of people are actually being absorbed in urban areas. We had a very interesting experience in a refugee camp, Palestinian refugee camp, north of Tripoli, that had been demolished in a fight, and the government was trying to reconstruct it, and refugees have no right to work in Lebanon. We looked at these settlements that had spilled over from the camp, and it was basically an urban hub in a rural area. And the refugees were providing medical skills, the doctors, the engineers, the dentists, and the trading. So basically an urban hub had been created in a rural area. It was completely accepted, completely integrated. Only become when it was lifted to the formal policies of having to reconstruct that the problem came. But the reality, the practice was extremely a full integration without the formal rights, but the de facto rights.
Well, I think this is exactly the kind of thing that we're coming up against very often here. I mean, we have many examples, even in the U.S., of Bosnians in St. Louis or Somalis in Minneapolis, revitalizing sort of abandoned neighborhoods and areas, industries, and so forth. But then the question would be, so we have the physical, but then we have the political and the policy, and how. I mean, it's a real problem in terms of creating sort of an agenda for a new open city, a new open system. Obviously, one's status then becomes a problem, maybe after 20 years, 30 years, when you look at Palestine, who knows, 50, 60 years. And I guess I'm wondering, what kinds of discussions or new urban agendas are there to deal with this incredible change in what citizenship actually means today?
Yeah, and maybe what are the boundaries of those subjectivities, right? I mean, in a way, they're constructions, right? I guess, are there soft boundaries? Who defines under which category one falls in, right? The detained, the refugee, the asylum seeker, all of those are so incredibly open-ended. So the status, it's always a bit difficult. It's very subjective in a way. Under what category or umbrella somebody might fall in.
Could I?
Any comment?
Yeah, can I comment here?
Yes.
Thank you. No, that's really a very interesting set of questions, and I think I just want to build on what Filipe kind of said. I mean, the way I might just sort of not twist that question or move it sideways for a second is putting on a sub-question in that how do we construct or how do we structure the debate in the way that it is more aligned with our disciplinary knowledge in terms of how we might be able to respond, because these are such big discussions that before you know it, the question of politics and the social dimensions engulfs it so much that I think as designers we become really helpless. And so the question is also, how do we kind of structure the question in a way that might be useful? And I think one of the things that's contingent on us is also nuancing. I hesitatingly use the word taxonomy just because I can't find another word right now, but even of migrants. So, and then what are their trajectories? I think if we have to seriously engage in this question with the spatial dimension, I think we have no choice but to break this down much more finely. So, I mean, just to give you we can break this down into many forms all the way in terms of a taxonomy from the individual to family to large communities, because the impact each of these sort of units, if you use those metrics, have on place is quite different. Yeah, and then you have the distressed migrants and the bright light attracted migrants. So I think it can be kind of nuanced in many ways. I think right now, because of the urgency of the problem, we are very focused on these large displacements that are happening of large-scale refugees. So that's, I think, one set of questions that's important. The second, and this goes, for example, between Colombia and Venezuela, you're now having a reverse migration. And so what does that mean? So what is the trace that migrants leave? Can we anticipate how embedded they will be within communities versus using it as a stepping stone to something else? And many border towns experience that. So therefore, the question of what physical trace is left becomes an anticipatory strategy in some ways for us. I'm now talking purely from the perspective of the agency of design. And so the question and the narrative, I think, that we need to shift is that how do local populations benefit from it? And one was just sort of, in listening to you guys, I was just sort of thinking that, for example, housing, if one can anticipate through a more nuanced reading that it's going to create a demand for housing, even let's say for a decade, then maybe the subsidy should go to local residents to add rooms to their homes or to develop housing. We tend to focus on creating housing separately for migrants, which doesn't allow for integration. And the same thing for public space, for spaces of transaction, etc. So the question could be, as a narrative, what is the trace that the impact of migration leaves on a settlement for the future, even if the migrants disappear, if there is a reversal. So maybe, and this is just one example, maybe I think we need to ourselves as a discipline modify the narratives a little bit.
So at this point, we'd like to sort of open up the conversation to everybody in the audience. Oh, and we already have some questions. Can you?
Hi Rahul, hi Filiep. Two questions. One to Filiep. Habitat or C40, are they ignorant or are they afraid of sanctuary cities? And one for Rahul. We are always talking about people without housing, but a lot of our research now, we know that there is a lot of housing without people, whether that's Fort Precinct, which is a working district, Colaba, so, or whether that's Battery Park City. So there is actually more housing without people. So those are the two questions I have.
We're going to take a few questions, so then our speakers can answer. So any other questions? Want to run up, Karen?
This has kind of been provoked by Professor Mehrotra's or Mr. Mehrotra's presentation. I was impressed with this, your idea about the sort of mobility of service industries in India, and I think I've seen that quite a bit. And my question is how you can apply such an economic structure and service structure to maybe refugee systems in countries that don't have this, this tradition, and also that may have codes that would interfere with such an implementation. Have you thought about this issue a little bit? Because it's such a tempting solution to many problems and difficulties of transiency.
We have another question before the answers start.
My question is, we have heard a few words. One is urban democracy, social cohesion, and in the case of India, how do you design when taking into consideration the social aspect of it? By what I mean by that is when you have a caste system, how do you address that?
I think that's good.
So let's go through that first.
Okay. So.
I can start. A little bit scared now. But no, I think, the UN is in general trying to redefine its role in all of this, specifically exactly because the way we advance global agendas is changing by definition. The UN is very aware that we need to really take different actors much more seriously, see these local governments to begin with, but of course private sector and others. Within that, and this is a little bit what we try to do with the book, we have global agendas, we get mandates to help governments to implement them, but we also, this is what the Secretary General is also doing, there are some of the issues out there, frontier issues, that are not yet, we haven't fully yet understood the consequences or what it means and what it will take us to deal with it. The impact of technology, rethinking governance and democracy, those we do have a role, and that's where we're trying to play much more consciously to provoke discussion and to make sure we call on the voices to kind of weigh in and at least make sure the debate keeps going and becomes as more focused. And then again, at some point it will be ready for kind of a member state-led discussion and agreements. But I think we are shifting the way we look at our own role as the United Nations.
Thank you. Rahul, would you like to respond to a couple of the questions that have been addressed to you?
Yeah, well, yes, thank you. No, I mean, I think the question of housing, which was addressed to me, that there's more housing than people. Well, I'm not sure that's 100% factually correct, but I know what the question was intending to ask, which is vast amounts of public housing under formal state schemes that are lying empty, besides in the downtown areas. And I think that's just because it's the wrong housing. It's housing in the wrong place. Often the government is trying to, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, has tried to meet the numbers as sort of political rhetoric. And this is mass housing in perimeter areas. It's called affordable housing only because the land is cheap and the physical artifact is cheap. So it's called affordable housing, but it's got nothing to do with livelihoods and that trinity of good urbanism, which is dwelling, livelihood, and mobility, or the interconnection between the two, is completely disconnected. And so the poor have to locate near their place of work, and that is, as we know globally, the reason why you have slums or favelas is for that proximity. And so I think a lot of housing policy in India, especially in the hurry to meet the numbers, in the last 4 or 5 years has been negative on account of that. And I think it goes back also, Loukia, to the question that you flagged, which is transitionary versus absolute solutions, and this sort of production of 3 million units in 5 years or whatever targets the government sets, and therefore produces the kinds of cities that Filipe showed us, are absolute solutions. If you actually try to understand what is the nature of housing that is necessary in this transitionary condition, the typologies change completely. I mean, we are caught in an imagination of taking single family units and stacking them and aggregating them one above the other. Whereas if you for a minute believe that what's happening in India is this amazing flux where 300 million people move between landscapes through the year, then what we need are more YMCA type of housing, or we need more, the traditional Goan clubs that used to exist in Mumbai, where people who came from villages off the cropping season would stay in communities and go back to their villages. You need transitionary housing. It's a whole different type, which is what the government should be actually imagining. And I think this is also related to the question of caste in a way. Cities are great condensers, and they dissolve some of these disparities which otherwise are heightened in rural or in smaller settlements. But if we get this sort of formula of livelihoods, dwelling, and the interconnection right, then you have a lot of that dissolved too. And of course, the caste question is much more complicated, and I noticed when the camera moved that my friend Vajayanti Rao was in the front row, and she would probably be able to, in much more articulate terms, respond to that question than I can ever.
Just want to build on one point Rahul said in terms of exactly working with the efforts of people themselves. And it's exactly when we were working in Lebanon and Jordan, that's how it was the only way exactly to engage local communities and mayors and basically saying, look, we will invest in infrastructure, help to extend manager growth, we will settle whoever just came as part of that. And if these people leave, you will be left with the planned infrastructure and the added value. Same on housing, exactly. Grants were being given, there's a lot of incremental housing happening in Jordan and Lebanon. We were giving grants, small grants to people, just quickly add a story. just quickly kind of add to what they were already doing, just accelerate it, but the grants were given to the families themselves on the condition, of course, that they would help to host some of the refugees.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly some of the kinds of examples that we had in mind and that are discussed facilitate. And so, I mean, your point earlier about, you know, the number of refugees in cities, I mean, you know, both of us started working on this problem with our students during the height of the Syrian civil war, and, you know, Turkey was receiving 3.5 million refugees, and, you know, 80-90% were really living in cities. They were not in the camps. Now, that's another story, what's happening today, and we will hopefully not see a whole resurgence all over again, inshallah. But, you know, I just want to really thank you both for really engaging in that kind of discussion and to understand that there really are systems and policies that are beginning to get into place. We know it's a long, long journey from idea and concept to implementation, but through both of your work, it sounds like it's really, there's some great examples of things happening in the right direction. Are there some last questions? Comments?
Thank you so much. Thank you for this whole event. Looking forward to actually reading the book now. And Rahul and Filipe, thank you very much for your both your contributions, which incredibly thought-provoking. It made me think actually, you know, Rahul, the way you presented the whole kind of taxonomic problem of urbanization, and Filipe, you referred, I noticed, you know, you use the word cities much more than Rahul did, which I thought was very interesting. This, I think it's such a major debate. I'm not a designer, or, you know, I'm not an architect, but I'm an anthropologist, and I find it a very useful moment to take a pause and think about, you know, what we mean by cities, and also to reflect, Rahul, on your, you know, sort of theoretical framing of transient or transitioning spaces or landscapes, where it seems to me what you're both pointing to is that there are places that we call cities that have historically existed or accrued over time, and these are places with infrastructure that people are moving towards. And then Rahul, you're speaking about places towards which infrastructure needs to be pushed. So this whole kind of notion of migration, you know, where we think about migration as this push-pull kind of process, we can maybe reframe it by thinking about, you know, the migration, this pushing and pulling being applied to infrastructure as well. Because I think there's infrastructures that pull, that we call cities, you know, including formal governance structures. And then there are infrastructures that push, or that need to be pushed rather, towards those, you know, already or nascent urban formations. It's much more of a comment really on where we are in the taxonomy and the classificatory nature of our disciplinary thinking than an observation rather than, you know, any kind of comment about what you have said. But it's been incredibly provocative. I wonder why, you know, if you might reflect on, Rahul, why you do not use the word city so much. Well, Filipe, you know, you do use it. And I'm assuming there is not just empirical, but also very conceptual differences to be teased out.
Can I respond?
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, just in the spirit of these being observations and comments, I'll just sort of extend it, and two things come to mind. One, a response more specifically to the use of the city, and the other on the question of infrastructure. And I think, you know, what's really interesting is in both the conditions you're describing, really the aspiration of infrastructure as the new commons in a way becomes very compelling as an idea. But I think it also challenges us to think about what are the new forms of infrastructure, and what does infrastructure mean beyond, piped water? And because now even how you deal with water changes. Now, of course, technologies take us in a completely other different direction. We're beginning to understand the role of cultural infrastructure in the way it can assist in the formation of communities, including migrant communities, first generation absorption within settlements. So, I think just the rubric of infrastructure as a category gets challenged and becomes much more expansive if you begin to accept that one has to, even the urban imaginary has to change in terms of the transitions and all of that kind of thing. So, I think that's something that's worth debating and us as a community expanding, because it will be very useful in the way it provides us clues for our own agency as designers. And then very quickly, I'm struggling in this understanding of the emergent landscapes in India of settlements, is that whether the urban-rural binary is helpful. So one is struggling to actually, in the same way as the use of kinetic to describe the Mumbai condition, one is trying to use urban as little as possible to see if one can categorize this movement in some other way. So it's really part of my own process of thinking through this, and I have no kind of dogmatic view on whether it should be used or not. But I just think the urban-rural binary is just not any longer convincing, as I showed you with 65,000 people settlements that are yet villages, and smaller settlements of a few 500 people operating with big agro-industry in a corporate way. It's challenging us to think of how we even categorize these formations. So.
I'll start with saying that my use of the word cities is maybe lack of adaptability on my side to move on to changing the way we talk about, because it is, and I think more and more we talk about cities as the actors, and including in the book we talk about urbanization as a process, and exactly across territories. And there's no longer a clear line between urban and rural. We talk about urban-rural continuum in our own kind of way of talking. That urbanization is a process. Now, process for what and what does it deliver? And there I think we have a bit of an issue, because even internally, the urbanization we see with exactly increasing access to services, internet, across territories, which you can see as urbanization, goes a little bit against what we then will call quality urbanization, or the urbanization we need to be able to deal with climate, protecting the national environment, dealing with biodiversity challenges. So the difference between what we call good urbanization versus the process and the reality of urbanization is one of our biggest challenges, because we don't have two different words for it. It's the same word as we speak.
I think, unless someone else has a pressing question, we would like to end here and thank you both very, very much, Rahul and Filiep, for a really engaging conversation, and to all of you for participating in this evening and this event. There are two themes that or phenomena that you highlighted that I would just like to close with. From you, Filiep, a quote from the Global Alliance for Urban Crises, where you say, urbanization is defining our global reality and will shape our future. And I think that's very much true, however we call that urbanization. It is certainly going to do that with climate change. And Rahul, the very poetic and very true notion that we are obsessed with permanence, but change is the only constant in our lives. We'd like to leave you with those thoughts as young aspiring planners and architects, and look forward to continuing the conversation on November 7th.